The man's quiet evening was shattered when flames rose from his home. He had been sitting with a cup of tea, the night peaceful, the sound of crickets soft in the background. But then came the smell of smoke, sharp and bitter. He looked up and saw orange light flickering through his window. At first he thought it was a neighbor burning leaves, but the glow grew larger and louder. He rushed outside and froze. His house was on fire. Flames climbing higher and higher. Neighbors came running. Some gasping, some shouting. Children cried as the heat rolled across the street. The sky filled with thick black smoke, and in the middle of the crowd stood the HOA president. Her arms folded, a strange smile touching her lips. She did not shout for help. She did not look surprised. She only watched as the fire consumed his home. He ran forward, but the flames pushed him back, the crackling roar swallowing his voice. The windows burst one by one, glass raining onto the lawn. The neighbors tried to help with buckets and hoses, but the fire was too strong. Someone screamed to call the fire department. Sirens soon wailed in the distance, but by the time the trucks arrived the damage was already beyond repair. Firemen fought hard, water pouring into the inferno, but the house collapsed inward. Wood breaking, the roof falling. Like thunder, sparks shot into the sky and settled on the ground like dying stars. The man stood still, his face calm, his eyes colder than the flames. The neighbors whispered among themselves. Some said it must have been an accident. Others said they had heard rumors. Everyone knew the HOA president had argued with him days ago. She had warned him about refusing membership. Her voice sharp as she said rules were rules, and he had quietly said no, refusing to bend. Now his house was gone, burned to the ground. And though she stood at a distance pretending to be worried, her eyes betrayed her. They were not filled with fear or sadness. They were filled with a satisfaction she could not fully hide. Children clung to their parents, scared of the fire but more scared of the strange silence of the man. He did not cry, he did not scream, he did not beg, he only watched, his jaw tight, his hands steady, the fire reflected in his eyes like cold steel. When the flames finally died, nothing remained but blackened walls, broken beams, and ash blowing across the street. The firemen shook their heads. One of them said it was suspicious. The way the fire started so quickly, almost like fuel had been poured. But they said little more, taking their notes and leaving. The president stepped closer, her voice fake with concern. She asked him if he was all right, her tone dripping with false pity. But he did not answer. He only turned his head slowly to look at her, his eyes sharp, his silence louder than any reply. She shifted uncomfortably, her smile twitching. Then she walked away. Neighbors noticed her quick steps, her nervous glance back at the ruins. They whispered quietly, wondering if she had gone too far this time. The man walked into the ashes the next morning, the air still heavy with smoke, his shoes crunching on broken wood. He bent down and picked up a small burned frame. The glass cracked. The picture inside blackened. He held it for a long moment, then set it gently back on the ground. Around him neighbors stood in silence. No one knew what to say. Some offered food, some offered a place to stay. He thanked them politely, but his voice was flat, distant. His silence was not weakness. It was something deeper, something stronger. By afternoon the president came again, this time with her clipboard. She walked around the ruins as if inspecting them, her pen scratching notes. She told the neighbors loudly that this was what happened when rules were ignored. She said he should have joined the HOA, that the community needed order, her words sharp and cruel. But the neighbors only stared at her, some whispering angrily, others looking away in shame. The man heard every word but did not reply. He stood tall among the ashes, his silence more powerful than her threats. That night the street was quiet again, but the silence was not peaceful. It was heavy with fear and suspicion. Some neighbors stayed at their windows, watching, waiting. They had all seen the strange smile on her face when the fire raged. They had all heard her threats before, but none dared speak too loudly. She had ruled them for too long, punished them for small mistakes, fined them for things they could not control. She was the law in their world. And yet now, for the first time, doubt spread like smoke through the neighborhood. Inside a borrowed room the man sat at a small desk, the light dim, his hands resting calmly on a black notebook. He opened it and began to write, line after line, his handwriting steady, his eyes unblinking. He wrote every detail, every word she had spoken, every move she had made. He wrote about the fire, the way it spread too quickly, the way she smiled, the way she pretended to care. He wrote with the patience of a man who had seen such things before. He wrote not with anger but with precision. because silence was his weapon, and patience was his strength. Outside the ruins of his home sat in darkness, the blackened wood standing like broken teeth against the night sky. The wind carried the smell of smoke, the ashes shifting softly. The neighbors lay awake, their minds replaying the fire, the strange smile, the cold silence of the man. They did not yet know who he truly was. They did not yet know what power he carried, but soon they would, and when they did, the smiles of the president and her board would vanish forever. Because the fire that destroyed his house had lit another fire inside him. A fire colder and sharper than the flames that burned wood. A fire that burned for justice, and it had only just begun. The morning after the fire, the street was strangely quiet. Smoke still drifted in the air and the smell of burned wood clung to every corner. The man stood in front of the ruins of his home. The ground black, the walls fallen, and the air heavy with silence. Neighbors came out slowly, some holding their children close, some crossing their arms nervously. They whispered to each other, but their eyes kept drifting toward him. No one knew what to say. How could words fix the sight of a man's entire life turned into ashes overnight? He bent down and picked up a piece of charred wood. It crumbled in his hand. He dropped it and straightened his back. His face calm but his eyes cold, colder than the morning air. The HOA president arrived soon after, her steps sharp, her clothes neat, her clipboard in her hand as always. She acted like she was shocked, her mouth opening in fake surprise. Her voice filled with practiced concern as she told the crowd how unfortunate it was. She said loudly that accidents like this happened when safety rules were ignored. She said rules existed for a reason and that those who refused HOA membership put the community at risk. Her words sounded smooth, but the neighbors caught the smirk hiding in her eyes, a cruel spark that betrayed her real feelings. She looked at the ashes not with sadness but with pride, as if she had proven a point. The man looked at her slowly, his face unreadable. He said nothing. He only stood there among the ruins, and his silence made her uncomfortable. She had expected anger, shouting, maybe even begging. But instead she faced calmness, and calmness was something she could not control. She turned to the neighbors, raising her voice, reminding them all that she had warned him. She said rules must be followed or consequences would come. She spread her arms as if the burned house behind her was proof of her power, but instead of fear she saw something else in the crowd. A flicker of doubt, a whisper of rebellion. One neighbor, an older man, muttered softly that it was strange how fast the fire had spread. Another whispered that they had seen shadows near the house before the flames. But when the president's eyes snapped toward them, their voices died quickly. They lowered their heads, afraid to speak further. She smiled again, satisfied that her control still worked. She tapped her clipboard with her pen, telling everyone that this was a warning, that the HOA existed to protect, and those who refused would always face risks. Her voice cut through the air like a knife. But the neighbors' eyes drifted away, some shaking their heads secretly. The man walked slowly through the ruins, his shoes crunching over broken glass. He bent to pick up a melted piece of metal, maybe once part of his kitchen, maybe once part of his bedroom. He studied it for a moment, then dropped it again. He never said a word. His silence carried more weight than her long speech. One by one the neighbors left, their eyes heavy with questions they dared not ask aloud. The president stayed a moment longer, pretending to comfort him, placing her hand on his shoulder, but when he turned his eyes on her, sharp and unblinking, she quickly pulled her hand back and walked away, her heels clicking fast against the pavement. Later that day the insurance agent arrived, his suit neat, his eyes cold. He walked around the ashes, shaking his head, taking pictures, and finally he told the man something that made the neighbors who were listening gasp. He said the HOA had filed papers weeks ago, blocking coverage because the homeowner refused to join. He said there would be no payout, no help. The man's house was gone and the insurance would not pay a single dollar. The president appeared again, pretending to act surprised, saying rules were rules, that he should have listened. Her smile returned, this time wider. But behind her smile was fear, because the man did not argue, he did not beg, he only nodded slowly, his eyes colder than ever. That night the neighborhood felt different. Whispers spread from house to house. People began to connect the pieces, her threats, her smile during the fire, the blocked insurance, too many coincidences to ignore. Yet fear kept them silent. No one wanted to be her next target. So they stayed quiet, locking their doors, pulling their curtains, pretending nothing had happened. But inside their hearts they were uneasy. And inside the burned ruins the man stood quietly under the moon, his arms Folded, his eyes locked on the president's house across the street. He did not move for a long time, and those who saw him through their windows felt a chill, because his silence no longer looked like weakness, it looked like the calm before a storm. He returned to the small borrowed room where he was staying and once again opened his black notebook. He wrote everything with steady hands: the time of the fire, the way it spread, the president's smile, her words about rules, the insurance trick. He filled page after page, his notes cold, precise, like evidence in a case, and in truth that was exactly what they were. Because he was not a broken man, he was a man waiting, a man building something stronger than fire. By midnight the street was silent, the ashes still smoking faintly, the neighbors sleeping uneasily, and the HOA president sitting in her living room sipping wine, convinced she had won, convinced she had destroyed him. She laughed softly to herself, but she did not see the way her curtains moved slightly. The man's eyes watching from across the street, calm, steady, patient, he said nothing, but in his silence was a promise that what she thought was victory was only the beginning of her downfall. The days after the fire dragged on like a heavy shadow. The man moved quietly among the ruins of his home. Neighbors watched him from a distance, some pitied him, some feared what would come next, and across the street the HOA president walked proudly with her clipboard, her smile sharper than ever. She believed she had broken him. She believed silence meant defeat, but she was wrong. One morning an insurance agent arrived in a neat suit carrying a folder. He shook the man's hand stiffly and began walking through the blackened rubble, snapping pictures, making notes. The neighbors gathered slowly, curious, hoping maybe the man would finally get help. But after a long inspection the agent sighed and delivered words that cut deeper than fire. He said the claim could not be processed. He explained that weeks before the HOA had filed papers declaring the property non-compliant due to refusal of membership. He said the coverage was blocked, no payout would come, the house was gone and the man would receive nothing. Gasps spread among the neighbors, whispers hissed through the air. All eyes turned to the president standing nearby. Her smile thin but full of pride. She stepped forward pretending to act surprised. Her voice smooth as she told everyone that rules were rules. She said she had warned him that membership was important. She said refusing to join meant refusing protection. Her words floated like poison, but her eyes gleamed with victory. She thought she had finally buried him. Yet the man only nodded once, his face calm, his silence cutting through her fake sympathy. That afternoon he returned to his borrowed room carrying a small stack of documents. He laid them on the desk next to his black notebook, his hands steady as he opened the pages. Inside were letters, notices, records of every warning she had sent, every fine she had tried to force, and now the insurance denial. He wrote carefully, recording every detail, the way the agent spoke, the exact words he used, the expression on the president's face. His notes were not written in anger, they were written like evidence, cold and precise, as if he were preparing for something bigger than any neighbor could imagine. The neighbors meanwhile grew restless, some gathered in small groups whispering about what had happened. An old woman shook her head saying it was not right. A younger man muttered that this was no accident. One woman admitted she had seen the president walking near his yard the night before the fire. But fear kept their voices low. No one dared speak openly. The president still held too much power. She still carried her clipboard like a weapon, and her threats still echoed in their memories. But the seeds of doubt were planted, each whisper spreading like cracks in a wall. That evening the president approached him boldly, standing among the ashes with her arms folded. She spoke loudly so the neighbors could hear. She said she felt sorry for him. But rules were rules. She reminded him that she had offered membership many times, that he had refused. She acted as though she was the victim, that his stubbornness had caused this tragedy. She shook her head and sighed dramatically, but the neighbors watching saw her eyes. They saw the smirk hiding behind her words. The man listened quietly. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply turned and walked away, and that silence unsettled her more than any accusation could. At night the man sat again with his notebook, the lamp light dim, his pen scratching steadily. He wrote about her speech, about the way she twisted blame. He wrote about the neighbors' whispers, their unease, their fear. He wrote as though each word was a brick, building something solid, something unshakable. And when he finished he closed the notebook and placed it carefully beside him, his eyes staring at the wall but seeing something beyond, a vision of what was to come. His face calm, his silence carrying weight. Meanwhile, inside her comfortable house, the president poured herself a glass of wine and laughed softly. She thought victory was hers. She thought the man would leave the neighborhood in shame, that his silence was weakness, but deep down her chest tightened each time she remembered his eyes. Eyes that did not break, eyes that did not fear. She tried to push away the unease, telling herself she had won. Yet the unease remained, whispering to her in the dark. The neighborhood itself felt different now. Children no longer played freely, adults avoided eye contact. The blackened ruins stood as a reminder of her power and his silence. But under that silence something was shifting, something was building, though no one knew it yet. The insurance trick that she thought would destroy him had only added fuel to a fire she could not see. A fire colder and more dangerous than the one that burned his home. A fire for justice that was only beginning to rise. The days passed slowly after the insurance denial, and the street felt heavy with tension. The burned house stood like a scar in the middle of the neighborhood. The air smelled of smoke even when the wind blew clean. Neighbors walked faster past the ruins, some lowered their eyes, some glanced nervously at the HOA president who still marched proudly with her clipboard. Her heels sharp against the pavement, she smiled at those who looked at her, a smile that was more like a warning than kindness. But inside their homes whispers grew louder. People remembered what she had done to them in the past. The man's fire had shaken something loose in their hearts. One evening, small groups of neighbors gathered near the edge of the street. They spoke in low voices. One woman said she could not forget how the president fined her $500 for leaving Christmas lights up 1 week longer. Another man clenched his fists as he told how she threatened him with legal letters for planting flowers not on her list. An older couple shook their heads, saying she once humiliated them in front of everyone for having a faded mailbox. The stories kept pouring out, each voice trembling with anger that had been buried for years. And now it surfaced because they had seen too much. The fire, the smirk, the insurance trick. It was all too much to ignore. The man sometimes walked by as they whispered, his step steady, his face calm. He never stopped to join them, but his silence gave them courage. His presence reminded them that they were not alone. And slowly the fear that had chained them for so long began to crack. One neighbor finally said aloud what many were thinking, that the fire was no accident, that it was punishment for refusing membership. Others nodded, their eyes shifting toward the president's house, their voices rising just enough for courage to grow. The president noticed the change. She saw groups forming, people whispering, eyes meeting in ways they never had before, and it made her uneasy. So she called a sudden meeting. She stood in the cul-de-sac with her clipboard, her voice sharp as she announced new rules, stricter parking limits, higher fines for lawn decorations, threats of fees for those who did not comply. She thought tightening her grip would silence them, but instead the neighbors exchanged looks, their jaws tight, their patience thinner. The man stood at the back of the group watching quietly, his eyes steady, and that was enough to make her voice falter for a moment. Later that night, a group of neighbors knocked quietly on the man's door. They offered him food, blankets, even a place to stay. He accepted their kindness politely, speaking only a few words, but those words carried weight. He thanked them without showing fear, and his calmness inspired them. They began sharing their stories openly, one by one, around his burned yard, their voices stronger than before. They admitted they had lived in fear, that they had paid fines they knew were unfair, that they had kept silent because they were afraid of being targeted. But now, seeing his silence, seeing the way he stood tall even after losing everything, they felt courage rising inside them. The president watched from her window, her eyes narrowing. She saw the small crowd gathered around him, saw them talking, some even laughing softly, and for the first time she felt the edges of her power slip. She gripped her wine glass tighter, telling herself it was nothing, that they would never dare go against her. But deep inside, a cold seed of fear began to grow, because she had seen that kind of silence before, the kind that meant patience, the kind that meant planning. The next morning the neighbors were different. They no longer avoided each other's eyes. They greeted each other openly, their voices louder, their steps firmer. The man walked among them, still silent but acknowledged with nods and respect. The president came out with her clipboard ready to bark orders. But when she spoke, the crowd did not shrink back. They stood straight, arms folded, some even smirking, and her words stumbled. She shouted louder. But the louder she shouted, the weaker she seemed. The fire that was supposed to break one man had instead lit a spark in the whole neighborhood. And though she still smiled, that smile no longer looked like power, it looked like desperation. That night the man sat again at his desk, his notebook open. He wrote about the whispers, the stories, the gathering of courage. He wrote that fear was breaking and that truth was spreading. His pen scratched steadily across the page. His silence remained his weapon. But now he had allies. Though they did not yet know how far he would go, he closed the notebook, placed it carefully on the table, and looked out the window toward her house, the curtains drawn tight, the light glowing faintly behind them, and he knew she was inside pacing, trying to convince herself she was still in control. But the truth was already slipping from her hands, and soon everyone would see it clearly. 2 days later the neighborhood woke to a strange quiet. The kind of silence that comes before a storm. The man walked slowly to his mailbox, the ruins of his home still dark and heavy behind him. He opened the box and found a thick envelope stamped with federal markings. His fingers turned it over once. Before he carried it back inside, neighbors watched from their porches, their eyes curious, their whispers low. When he sat at the small table in his borrowed room, he opened the envelope carefully and read every line. It was not addressed to him but to the HOA president. Her full name written in bold. The letter was official, a summons to appear in federal court. The charges listed were serious: misuse of HOA funds, fraudulent documents, and violations that stretched back years. His lips pressed together but his eyes gleamed faintly in the dim light. This was not just another piece of paper. It was the beginning of her collapse. Later that afternoon the president strutted into the cul-de-sac with her usual arrogance, her clipboard clutched in her hand. She pretended the fire and the whispers meant nothing. She barked at a neighbor about lawn decorations, fined another for a crooked fence. She smiled with her fake authority. But her world shifted when she returned home. For waiting on her doorstep was the same envelope, thick and stamped. She picked it up curiously, ripped it open, and as her eyes scanned the first lines her face turned pale, her lips trembled, her hands shook. She read again and again but the words did not change. She was being summoned, the law had come for her. From across the street neighbors saw her stumble, saw her lean against her doorframe, her face drained of color. They whispered quickly, some daring to step closer. She noticed their eyes on her and quickly forced a smile, holding the paper tight against her chest. She called out loudly that it was nothing, just routine paperwork. But her voice cracked and no one believed her. She hurried inside, slamming the door, leaving behind a street buzzing with whispers. Inside she paced back and forth, her heels clicking on the floor, her wine glass untouched on the counter. Her hands clutched the letter as if squeezing it could erase the words. She muttered to herself, blaming the man, blaming jealous neighbors, blaming anyone but herself. Yet deep inside she knew her own lies had built this. The documents she had faked, the money she had taken, the threats she had thrown around so carelessly, now they were coming back to crush her. The man, meanwhile, sat quietly in his room, his black notebook open. He wrote every detail with calm hands. The time the envelope arrived, the look on her face, the whispers of neighbors. He placed the letter carefully beside the notebook, his eyes steady, his patience unbroken. He did not need to rush, because the truth had already begun its work. That evening neighbors gathered again near the ashes of his home. The mood was different this time, stronger, bolder. People talked openly now. An older man said he had seen her take HOA funds for her own yard repairs. A young mother whispered that she had always suspected false paperwork. Another neighbor admitted he had once paid a fine without ever seeing proof of violation. The stories spilled freely, their fear fading, their anger rising. And at the center of it all stood the silent man. Listening, nodding, his calmness feeding their courage. The president peeked through her curtains, her hands gripping the fabric tight. She saw the crowd forming again, saw the way their faces no longer looked at her with fear but with disgust. Her stomach twisted. She pulled the curtains closed and leaned against the wall, breathing hard, telling herself she still had power, telling herself she could still control them. But deep down she knew the letter was a chain she could not break. Night fell and the street grew quiet, the ashes of the burned house glowing faintly under the moon. The man sat at his desk, the official papers beside him, the black notebook filled with evidence. His eyes steady as he closed the book and leaned back. In the distance he could see her house dark, no movement, no sound. She was trapped inside her own fear, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the whole neighborhood saw what he already knew. The fire had taken his home, but justice was about to take hers. The next morning the street buzzed with rumors. Neighbors stood in small groups whispering about the envelope the president had received. Some said it was nothing. Some said it was serious, but all of them had noticed how pale she looked, How quickly she had slammed her door. The man walked calmly down the street, his steps steady, his face unreadable. He greeted a few neighbors politely. They looked at him differently now, not just with pity but with curiosity, as if they were beginning to see something more. Later that day, an older neighbor, a retired teacher, came to him and asked softly if it was true that he had connections in law. The man only smiled faintly and said nothing. His silence was enough to keep the rumor alive. By evening the whispers grew stronger. The story spread from porch to porch. The man was not just an ordinary homeowner. He was something more. Some claimed he had once worked with law enforcement. Others said he was a lawyer. One bold voice finally said aloud what everyone would soon know. He was a federal judge. The weight of those words spread like fire through dry leaves. Neighbors gasped, their eyes wide. Suddenly his silence, his calmness, his black notebook, everything made sense. He had not shouted because he did not need to. He had not fought openly because he carried power far greater than the HOA president could ever imagine. The president heard the whispers too. She stormed out of her house with her clipboard, her voice sharp as she shouted that the rumors were lies. She told the crowd that he was nothing but a bitter man, that he was spreading fake stories to turn people against her. She laughed loudly, but the laugh was hollow. Her eyes darted nervously toward his calm figure standing across the street. He did not respond. He simply watched her with steady eyes, and the more she shouted, the weaker she seemed. That night a group of neighbors gathered in front of the man, their voices trembling with excitement. One woman asked directly if it was true, if he was really a judge. For a moment he stayed quiet, letting the weight of the question linger. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a slim leather case, opening it slowly. Inside was a badge, gleaming under the streetlight. The neighbors gasped loudly, children whispered to each other, the crowd leaned closer, reading the words that confirmed what they had only guessed. Federal judge, the title heavy with authority. The president froze in place, her clipboard nearly falling from her hand, her face drained of color. Her lips parted but no sound came. Her mind raced back through every threat, every fine, every smug word she had thrown at him. And now she saw the truth. She had not destroyed a weak man. She had attacked someone far beyond her reach. Someone who carried the law in his hands. Someone who had the power to tear down her false kingdom. The neighbors turned toward her slowly, their expressions sharp, their whispers turning into open anger. The man did not boast. He did not raise his voice. He simply closed the badge case and slipped it back into his coat. His silence stronger than a speech. But in that silence the entire neighborhood shifted. Fear moved from the people to the president. Her legs shook. Her hand clutched the clipboard tighter. She tried to speak, stammering that it changed nothing, that HOA rules still mattered. But no one listened. The crowd only looked at her with disgust. Some even laughed bitterly. Others shook their heads. She rushed back to her house, slamming the door behind her. But the whispers did not stop. They grew louder, spreading through the night. Every porch light flickered as neighbors talked about what they had seen. Their fear of her replaced by respect for him. The man returned to his borrowed room and sat at his desk, his notebook open. He wrote down the day's events, the moment of truth revealed, the look on her face when she realized who he was. His pen moved steadily. Every word another nail in the coffin of her rule. Across the street the president sat alone in the dark, her hands shaking, the letter on her table, the memory of the badge burning in her mind. She thought she had destroyed him. But instead she had woken something far more dangerous. She was no longer the hunter. She was the prey, and deep down she knew her time was running out. The next morning the neighborhood felt different. The usual fear that had lived in every corner seemed weaker. Neighbors stood together in small groups, their voices louder, their eyes sharper. The story of the badge had spread like wildfire. Everyone now knew the quiet man was not just a victim. He was a federal judge. The weight of that truth gave them courage they had never felt before. The HOA president stepped outside clutching her clipboard, her face pale but covered with a fake smile. She tried to walk with the same authority she always had, but her steps were unsteady. Her eyes flickered nervously from one neighbor to another. She called out that there would be a meeting that evening and everyone must attend. Her voice cracked slightly, and instead of fearful silence the crowd murmured. Some even laughed softly. That evening the neighbors gathered in the cul-de-sac, the burned ruins of the man's house still standing like a black monument behind them. The president stood in the center, clipboard shaking in her hand. She raised her voice declaring that lies were being spread, that the man was trying to manipulate them. She shouted that HOA rules were still the law here. Her words came out fast and desperate. But before she could finish, one neighbor, the young mother with 2 children, stepped forward. Her voice trembling but strong, she said she was tired of being fined unfairly. She told everyone about the hundreds of dollars she had paid just because her children left their bikes outside one night. Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not stop. The crowd listened in silence. The president's face flushed red. She shouted that it was a lie. But then an older man stepped forward, his voice rough with anger. He said he had been forced to repaint his entire house because she disliked the shade of his walls. Another neighbor raised his voice, telling how she threatened him with court for planting flowers not on her approved list. One by one voices rose, louder and louder, confessions pouring out, years of pain and fear spilling into the night. The president screamed at them to stop, waving her clipboard wildly. But the more she shouted, the less they listened. The man stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, his arms folded, his eyes calm. He did not need to speak. The neighbors were speaking for him. His silence gave them strength. Every voice that rose made the president smaller. Every confession cracked her authority further. The clipboard that once symbolized fear now looked pathetic in her trembling hands. Her shouts turned into desperate cries. She begged them to remember her service, to respect the rules. But the people only shook their heads. Their fear had shifted, no longer chained by her threats. They saw her for what she was. As the night deepened, the neighbors' voices turned into a storm. Some shouted for her resignation. Others demanded answers for missing HOA funds. Children pointed and mocked her, recording videos on their phones. She spun in circles, her face pale, her hands shaking, tears forming in her eyes. For the first time she realized she was powerless. She had built her reign on silence and fear, and now both had crumbled. The man finally stepped forward. The crowd parted to let him through, his step steady, his face calm. He stopped in front of her and simply looked into her eyes. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. But his silence carried more judgment than words ever could. She trembled under his gaze, unable to hold it. She lowered her head, her clipboard slipping from her grasp and falling to the pavement with a hollow sound. Gasps filled the air. It was the sound of her rule ending. The neighbors erupted in cheers, some clapping, some shouting in relief. Their voices filled the night where once fear had ruled. The man turned slowly and walked back toward the ruins of his home. His silence still steady, his figure tall against the glow of streetlights. Behind him the president sank to her knees, tears rolling down her face, her voice breaking as she begged them to listen. But no one did. The collapse of fear was complete, her power was gone, and everyone knew it. Inside his small room later that night, the man opened his black notebook again. He wrote about what had happened, the way the neighbors stood tall, the way fear broke. He wrote every detail calmly, his eyes steady, because he knew this was only one step. The final judgment was still to come, and he was ready for it. The evening of the next HOA meeting arrived and the cul-de-sac was crowded. More neighbors showed up than ever before, the air buzzing with tension. The burned ruins of the man's home still stood behind them like a black scar. Everyone stared at the president as she stepped forward clutching her clipboard. Her face pale but her smile forced. She raised her voice claiming again that lies were being spread, that she had done nothing wrong. She waved her clipboard as if it was still a weapon. But no one flinched. The crowd only crossed their arms, waiting. The man stood silently near the back, his eyes steady. When she accused him of plotting against her, he finally stepped forward slowly. The neighbors moved aside to let him through, their eyes filled with curiosity, their breath held in suspense. He stopped at the front, pulled a small device from his coat, and without saying a word he pressed a button. A portable screen flickered to life. At first there was only static. Then the image grew clear. Gasps echoed through the night as everyone saw the familiar street under moonlight. The man's car in the driveway, his house still standing, and then a figure appeared, hood pulled low. But when the figure lifted her face under the glow of the streetlight, the crowd gasped again. It was the HOA president, her eyes sharp, her mouth twisted with anger. In her hand she carried a metal tool. She walked right up to the car, scratching deep lines into the paint, smashing the windshield, then stabbing the tires. The sound of breaking glass and hissing air filled the night from the speakers. The crowd froze in shock. The video did not end there. It showed her pacing back and forth, throwing papers into the yard, and then the faint flicker of fire as matches lit and were tossed toward the side of the house. The flames began to spread. The recording captured everything, her face clear, her actions undeniable. Neighbors covered their mouths. Some gasped aloud. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Children pointed, whispering. The president's face turned ghostly white. Her hands shook. Her clipboard slipped from her grasp, hitting the ground with a hollow clap. She screamed that it was fake, that it was edited, that he was lying. But her voice was drowned by the furious shouts of the crowd. Neighbors who had once been afraid now shouted angrily. One yelled that she had fined him for broken fences while she herself was a criminal. Another cried that she had stolen their peace for years. The young mother shouted that this was the woman who punished her children for toys left on the lawn. And now the proof of her cruelty burned on the screen for everyone to see. The president spun wildly, her hands waving, her words frantic, but no one listened. Every eye was on the screen, every heart beating with anger. Her empire of fear turned into ash in an instant. The man stood calmly, his face steady. He did not raise his voice, he only let the evidence speak. When the video ended, he closed the device and slipped it back into his coat. The silence that followed was heavy. All eyes shifted to her trembling form. Her lips moved but no words came. Her knees bent slightly as if the weight of the truth crushed her. She begged them to believe her. But not a single person stepped forward, they all stepped back, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the cul-de-sac. One of the HOA board members finally spoke, his voice firm and cold. He said this was enough. He said the evidence was undeniable, that she had broken every rule she had forced on others. He called for an immediate vote. Neighbors raised their hands quickly. Almost every hand in the crowd lifted. The decision clear. She was finished, her role as president gone, her reputation destroyed. She screamed that it was illegal, that she would sue them all. But her words fell into the night without power. The man turned slowly and walked back toward the ruins of his home, his steps calm, his silence heavier than all her shouts. The neighbors followed him with their eyes, respect glowing where once there had been pity. The president remained standing in the center, shaking, her eyes wet, her hands clutching the empty air where her power had once been. And though she still screamed, no one listened. The truth had spoken louder than her lies. The neighborhood had seen her real face. And there was no going back. That night the man sat at his desk, his notebook open. He wrote about the meeting, the video, the vote, his handwriting calm and steady. He closed the book and looked out the window. Across the street her house was dark, her curtains drawn, her empire gone. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady, because he knew this was not the end. The courtroom still waited, and her final judgment was coming soon. The day of the hearing arrived and the courthouse stood tall and cold under the gray morning sky. Neighbors whispered about it for days, their fear gone, replaced by a hunger for justice. The HOA president arrived first. Her steps shaky though she tried to walk proudly, her expensive clothes neat, her hair done perfectly. But her eyes betrayed the storm inside her. They darted nervously around the lobby, searching for support. But no one came. Her former allies had all turned their backs. When the man entered the room the atmosphere shifted. He walked slowly, dressed in simple dark clothes, his expression calm, his silence steady. He did not need to announce who he was. The moment he stepped through the doors everyone felt his authority. The judge who had been a victim now came not as prey but as power itself. Inside the courtroom the HOA board members sat stiff and pale. The president sat among them clutching her clipboard as if it could still save her. Her hands trembled when she tried to write. The gavel struck and the room fell silent. The presiding judge asked for opening statements. Lawyers read through stacks of evidence, financial reports, forged documents, and witness testimonies. The neighbors' voices echoed through the chamber as they spoke of fines that made no sense, threats that left them afraid, and the night of the fire when they saw her watching with a smile. Every word cracked her armor further. Sweat rolled down her face. She whispered to herself, shaking her head, but the evidence was too strong. Then came the recording, the same video the man had shown in the street. This time played on a large screen in front of the court. The sound of glass shattering, the sight of her scratching the car, slashing the tires, and finally lighting the fire. Gasps filled the courtroom. Some neighbors covered their mouths again though they had seen it before. Others shook their heads in disgust. The president jumped to her feet, screaming that it was fake, that it was a lie, but the presiding judge ordered her to sit down, his voice sharp, her defiance silenced. She sank back into her chair, tears sliding down her cheeks. The man sat still through it all, his hands folded, his eyes steady. He did not need to raise his voice. He did not even need to speak much. His silence was louder than her screams. When asked to testify, he spoke briefly, his words calm, measured, every sentence precise. He told the truth without exaggeration. And that truth was heavier than all her excuses combined. The courtroom listened closely, the weight of his title and his calmness pressing into every ear. Hours passed, and finally the presiding judge leaned forward, his voice firm as he read the verdict: guilty of fraud, guilty of abuse of power, guilty of arson and conspiracy. The words struck like hammers, each one breaking her further. The sentence was heavy: fines, removal from office, and prison for her crimes. The board members were stripped of their positions too, some fined, some banned from ever serving again. The president cried out, begging, her voice desperate. But no one listened. The gavel struck again, sealing her fate. The neighbors sitting in the gallery felt a wave of relief wash over them. Some smiled, some clapped softly despite the solemn atmosphere. They finally saw justice. They finally felt free. The man stood slowly and walked out, his silence still steady, his shoulders tall. He did not glance back at her. He did not need to. Her cries followed him down the hall, but they sounded smaller, weaker, powerless. The woman who once ruled with fear was nothing more than a broken voice in a cold courtroom. Outside the courthouse the sky had cleared, sunlight broke through the clouds. The neighbors gathered around him, thanking him, some shaking his hand, some even hugging him. Children looked at him with wide eyes, no longer as a victim but as a hero. He gave them only a faint smile and a nod, still calm, still silent, because he knew true justice did not need celebration, it needed to last, and he had delivered it. That night he returned to his neighborhood, the ruins of his home still waiting, but the street felt lighter, laughter drifted from porches, children played without fear. The president's house stood dark and empty, her car gone, her power gone, her name stained forever. The man sat by the ashes quietly, his black notebook in his lap. He wrote the final lines of her fall, then closed it and set it aside, his eyes calm, because though the fire had taken his house, the law had taken hers, and justice had finally been served. The morning after the trial the neighborhood was alive in a way it had not been for years. Children played freely on the sidewalks, their laughter rising through the air. Parents stood outside chatting without fear of sudden fines or warnings. The heavy shadow of the HOA president was gone. Her house sat dark and silent, her windows covered, her car missing from the driveway. Some neighbors whispered that it had been repossessed. Others said officials had taken it as part of the punishment. Whatever the truth, the once proud woman who had ruled with cruelty was gone, her power stripped, her name disgraced, her future chained by the very law she thought she controlled. The man walked down the street slowly, his steps calm, his face steady. Neighbors greeted him with respect. Some shook his hand, some simply nodded, but all of them looked at him with gratitude. He remained silent, his silence now a symbol of strength rather than mystery. The ruins of his house still stood black and broken, but they no longer looked like a sign of defeat. They looked like a reminder of how far the neighborhood had come. Workers soon arrived, trucks pulling in with supplies, construction crews ready to rebuild. And this time the neighbors offered to help. Some brought food, some carried tools, some simply stood nearby, lending their presence. For the first time in years they felt like a community again. They felt free. The man thanked them with a simple nod, his voice quiet but filled with weight. His silence did not make them uneasy anymore, it gave them comfort. Across the street the president's window stayed dark. She was gone, taken away to face her sentence. Her clipboard that once ruled the streets lay forgotten. A broken symbol of power lost. Neighbors passed her house without fear. Some even laughed softly. The sound like chains breaking. No one looked over their shoulders anymore. No one worried about petty fines or threats. The street was alive again. That evening the man sat quietly on the steps in front of the ruins, the sun setting behind him, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Children ran past laughing. Parents waved from porches. He sipped tea slowly, his eyes on the horizon, his heart steady. He thought of the fire that had taken everything, the smirk on her face as flames rose, the ash that had choked the street. He thought of the insurance trick, the whispers, the evidence, the courtroom, and finally the gavel that had sealed her fate. All of it played in his mind like a story written in fire and silence. But he did not feel broken, he felt stronger, because justice had been served. Later that night a gentle knock came on his door. It was the young mother with her children. She thanked him for standing up when no one else dared. She said his silence had given them courage. Her children handed him a small drawing they had made, a picture of a house standing tall with smoke rising behind it. But the sun shining above, he accepted it quietly, his lips curving into the faintest smile. He placed it carefully on the table next to his black notebook. As the night deepened, the street lights flickered on, the neighborhood was calm, free, alive. The man looked once more at the dark house across the street, the one that had once belonged to the president. And then he turned his eyes back to the ruins of his own home, soon to rise again from the ashes, stronger than before. He leaned back in his chair, his silence steady, his patience unbroken, because he knew one truth above all. Fire had taken his house, but it had also burned away the lies that ruled the neighborhood, and though his walls had fallen, justice had stood tall, and that was enough.